Okay, this is going to be a video in which continue on with book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. So after book 7, where he presents the function argument, we have a definition of eudaimonia that is a bit more contentful than what Aristotle had before. The function argument is how he argues for this account of what eudaimonia is. Eudaimonia is a life lived according to reason, and that's going to end up being the same thing as a life lived in accordance with virtue. And I want to stress here for a moment that it's a life lived. It's not just having virtue. That's not what's good. That's not what is good for you. What's good for you is to live your life in accordance with virtue. Just being rational or just being virtuous isn't enough if you're inactive. What Aristotle's describing requires activity, and that's going to be important later on. But in chapter 8 of book 1, he wants to survey some of the things that other people have said about the good, and he wants to show that this life makes sense of that. And he has a very easy job of showing that the life he's described, a life lived in accordance with virtue, makes sense of all the people who identified the good with virtue. Because he says, well, I mean, it's not strictly speaking identical to virtue, but it makes sense because you can't live a life in accordance with virtue, Aristotle thinks, if you don't have virtue. So for people who said, well, the good is wisdom, well, Aristotle will say, if you're virtuous, you'll be wise, and because you'll need to live a life in accordance with wisdom. For people who say happiness is prudence or the good is prudence, they'll say, well, again, in order to live a life in accordance with virtue, you need to have the virtues, one of which is prudence, so that's fine. The more interesting move he makes is when he describes, when he talks about people who thought that the good was pleasure. Because what he says is that the life lived in accordance with virtue will be full of pleasure. You might be like, well, how's that? What Aristotle says is basically this: once you're virtuous, you will take pleasure in virtue. Right? Aristotle's view is what counts for each person as pleasurable depends a great deal on how that person is constituted. Different things will be pleasurable to different people depending upon, as Aristotle would put it, the state their soul is in. A virtuous person will take pleasure in all the exercises of virtue that they engage in. In the same way that, think of it like this: when you're a little kid, you like really stupid music, right? Baby Shark is a great example. Baby Shark is a stupid song. It's a terrible song. But when you're a kid, you love it. And when you're a kid, if somebody plays you really good stuff, right? If someone plays you classical music like Beethoven, or if they play you like Miles Davis jazz or something like that, you're like, whatever. Once you get yourself to the point where you can appreciate what's going on, once you make the sort of cognitive and emotional steps, once you mature cognitively and emotionally enough where you can appreciate things like that, then listening to that kind of music gives you pleasure. You've changed, so what didn't used to give you pleasure now does. Just the point is, as you become a virtuous person, you will learn to take joy and pleasure in virtue. So what Aristotle says is this life will be a pleasurable life as long as you can successfully put your virtue into action. Because remember, it's an active life. It's not just having the virtues, it's acting on them. But what this means is, or what it suggests, is that pretty much any life that's not like completely unnatural is going to be one that can give you pleasure. And I put the restriction completely unnatural because there might be some ways you try to be which human beings just can't be. And so you can't ever come to take pleasure in that. So like there are people who have tried to, well, certain kinds of ascetics, right? People who deny themselves everything, right? They live in a cave and they only drink water and they don't talk to other people. They don't interact with other people. They don't do anything except sit there in silence and stuff like that. Aristotle would find that way of life unnatural, unfitting for a human being. You couldn't ever be wholehearted in that. You'll always be struggling against yourself. So in that way, yeah, you might not have pleasure, but that life's going to be out anyway, right? for Aristotle. But any life where you can like wholeheartedly be behind it, it seems what Aristotle's saying is, well, you'll get pleasure out of that, right? Once you fully adopt some set of values, once you fully adopt some way of life, you're going to get pleasure out of it. So at least with this argument, while the good life will be pleasurable, not all pleasurable lives will be the good life. So pleasure isn't a reliable sign of living a eudaimon life or of having eudaimonia. But if you do live the eudaimon life, if you do live a life in accordance with reason, you will experience pleasure. All right. At this point, Aristotle moves on to the issue that's going to dominate the rest of Book 1, and specifically chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12. And while he doesn't put it this way himself, this all comes back to luck. So I'm just going to talk about it in those terms. I'm not going to stick very close to the text here. I want to try to move through things quicker than a focus on the text would allow us. Plus, Aristotle's presentation of this is disorganized in some important ways. So, what do I mean by luck? Well, the way Aristotle has described eudaimonia so far, you might be tempted to think that the good life is immune to luck in the following way. If you're virtuous, you can always make the virtuous choice in any situation you're put in, where you get to choose between the virtuous action and the vicious action. You'll choose the virtuous action. And then you'll be living a life of active virtue and everything will be great. Right? It seems like, on the surface, whether or not you're happy is entirely under your control and so immune to luck, because it seems like what Aristotle's saying is all that there is to happiness, all that there is to eudaimonia, is making the virtuous choice when the choice is presented to you. But it's going to turn out that's not what Aristotle thinks. Aristotle is here moving some ways away from Plato. Plato at times sounds very much like he thinks you will be happy as long as you have the virtues, as long as your soul is in the state where you have the virtues, right? And so that you always make the virtuous choice. This seems to be kind of the challenge being put to Plato in the Republic by Glaucon and Adeimantus. Show us that someone who has a reputation for being unjust is still happier, but is actually just, is still happier than the person who's unjust but has the reputation for justice. If you have a reputation for injustice, you're going to get punished, right? You might be tortured even. Plato uses that example. And suggests that you'll still be happy. Well, Aristotle is going to say, nah, there are lots of things that can happen to you that can prevent you from living the happy life. So according to Aristotle, there's going to be a way in which the happy life is dependent on luck and a way in which it's not. And to show that, I'm going to introduce a distinction in kinds of luck, one that Aristotle doesn't draw himself, at least explicitly, but it's kind of, it's similar to the distinction he draws. So one kind of luck we'll call resultant luck. Resultant luck is the way in which chance or things outside of your control, right? Outside of your control that you can't anticipate, things like that, the way they impact how things turn out, right? So you take some action and you don't always know what's going to come of it. Sometimes you intend to do a good thing and it turns out you do a bad thing, right? So let's say you see somebody on the street fighting and you know, there's a much bigger, stronger person attacking a smaller person. And you intervene and you push the bigger person off the smaller person runs away. You've made a decision that you think, well, I'm going to defend this person from assault. But then it turns out the smaller person was a thief and the bigger person was actually just trying to get their stuff back. And so now you have performed an action which you intended to work out, or intended to be good, intended to be virtuous. But it hasn't worked out that way. Right? Maybe a better example would be you start a business, right? You don't know whether it's going to turn out well or not. It's to some extent a matter of luck whether it does. You can make all the right decisions, work really, really hard, and still end up with a failed business. Maybe you try to engage in some project right? Some charitable project to improve some kind of situation you find out about the world, but it doesn't work out, or it might work out, who knows? But resultant luck is luck in how a decision you make or a path you pursue, how it turns out. And then there really will be two kinds of luck here. Constitutive luck and circumstantial luck. I'll explain circumstantial luck first. Consider someone who was born in Germany in the 19 teens, like during World War One, or maybe even right before World War One. Right? You're born in Germany, and your parents are like, "This is crazy. The Kaiser is starting wars for no reason, right? Or at least getting involved in wars for no good reason." The Germans didn't really start World War One, and so they decide to move to Argentina. But their neighbors, who had a child around the same time, stay in Germany. Right? The Argentinian Germans grow up in Argentina. The child comes of age, born in the 19 teens, like let's say 1914. And so by the time Hitler comes to power, this child is now 20 years old, an adult now. They are outside of Germany. They're outside of the influence of Hitler's propaganda machine, and they look at what's happening in Germany, and they're like, man, I'm really glad my parents moved away because that place is just going insane. But the kid who was born in Germany and whose parents stayed in Germany is very likely to end up a Nazi. Right? They will have heard, starting when they were a teenager, all the messages of the Nazis, messages that seemed to convince a whole lot of Germans, got a bunch of Germans to go along with them. They were in circumstances that made it more likely than not that they were going to end up becoming a Nazi. And that's a kind of luck, right? It's not under your control whether your parents decide to get out of Germany or not get out of Germany. But it has a huge impact on how your life turns out. It has an impact on who you are morally, right? Because if you're never put in circumstances where you're under this kind of pressure, all the various kinds of pressures which cause so many Germans to become so morally compromised, then you have a much better chance of being a decent person. So there's circumstantial luck. Circumstantial luck is luck in the circumstances in which your decisions are made, in which the life you pursue sort of gets going, in which you decide which life to pursue, in which the choices about which kind of life to pursue are made available to you. The person in Argentina just has a different set of choices and a different set of pressures on those choices than the person in Germany. And that brings us to constitutive luck. And here I'm not going to use a moral example because example of the way constitutive luck could change who you are morally. It's a little tricky, but there's all sorts of ways in which constitutive luck does matter how your life turns out. So constitutive luck is luck in how you're constituted. If resultant luck is luck in how things turn out, and circumstantial luck is luck in the circumstances in which your decisions are made, then constitutive luck is luck in what you brought to those decisions. You brought yourself. You brought you and your capacities and your tendencies. And some people are just born with better or worse constitutive features, right? So some people are born more athletically gifted than others. There is no way that I will ever play basketball, and there never was a way, which I was going to play basketball as well as Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan was born with the genetic predisposition to be taller than me, faster, stronger, things like that. Right? That's not all that went into Michael Jordan being the greatest basketball player of all time. But it was a definite barrier to someone like me ever challenging him for that. Right? Some people are born smarter than others. Some people are born with a tendency to addiction. Some people are born without it. Right? Like, for example, some people can drink socially every once in a while, and it's no big thing, and they just don't drink to excess ever. Some people are such that if they drink, it's going to be a problem. Now, again, that doesn't determine the whole issue. Just like Michael Jordan's athleticism isn't the only thing that made him a great basketball player. Just like being born with high native intelligence doesn't mean you're going to be accomplished in some intellectual field. In the same way, being born with a predisposition to addiction doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get addicted. You might know this about yourself and avoid any addictive substances. But it is certainly true that there are differences between us that we're born with or that we pick up really early in life before we have any control over what happens. Right? So some people are the victims of like horrifying abuse when they're little. And that has an impact on you. It has an impact on who you grow up to be, and it's outside of your control. And once it's done, there's nothing you can do to undo it. Right? So things you're born with, things that happen to you before you have any control over what happens to you, your character, your nature. And that's constitutive luck. So here's the way to understand what Aristotle's saying. Oops. This kind of luck, constitutive luck and circumstantial luck, that matters. Or rather, the good life can depend on those kinds of luck in very important ways. So Aristotle already earlier in Book 1 made the point of saying that someone who was born in a situation where they were not brought up well is going to have great difficulty in becoming virtuous. They won't even understand what virtue is. Because you have to have some starting points of true moral beliefs in order to work out for yourself what the right thing to do is. And similarly, right, a similar point, someone who's been the victim of like horrifying abuse that like warps their character and mind, right? So there's all these statistics about people who were victims of abuse when they were young are much more likely to visit that same kind of abuse on their own children. There are attempts to explain why particular like mass murderers and serial killers, things like that, do what they do in terms of the abuse they suffered when they were younger. That matters, according to Aristotle. That can prevent you. Bad constitutive luck can prevent you from ever becoming virtuous and therefore happy, or eudaimon in the first place. Similarly, circumstantial luck, and here's something he talks about in chapter 8 some. He talks about needing external goods, and the prime example he uses is friends, in order to have the highest good, in order to have eudaimonia, to live the happy and good life. And the point he's making there is, sure, you can always make decisions to do the virtuous thing when the opportunity presents itself, but you're not going to have that many opportunities to do the virtuous thing if you're living a life in like abject poverty or completely alone. Right? This is why it matters that he isn't saying happiness is just having the virtues. Happiness is acting on the virtues. And you need things to perform a whole lot of actions, right? It's not like everybody is right now capable of doing all the same things. How much money you have determines what kind of stuff you can do. So for example, something that almost all of us would recognize as virtuous, that maybe Aristotle wouldn't have, at least not under this name or not in the same way conceptually, is charity, right? Giving to others. Now, Aristotle does have a couple of virtues that he talks about that do seem to have charitable tendencies to them, but the way he understands them is really weird, so we'll put that aside. But we believe, most of us, good people, that it's a virtuous thing to do to help out those in need. Well, what if you're one of the people in need? Right? Are we going to ask poor people to be charitable? Sometimes they are. There's like really sweet stories about people who are very needy themselves giving to those who are slightly more needy. But what if you're really, really at the bottom? Right? You never have the opportunity to be charitable towards other people. Right? You never have the opportunity to give people things with no hope of return because you need those things. There are all sorts of virtues like loyalty, which you can't exercise if you're absolutely alone. Who do you have to be loyal to if you have no friends in the first place? So Aristotle says external goods and friends are necessary to live a life of fully active virtue. And so if you find yourself in a situation where you never have any of those, you find yourself in a situation, Aristotle thinks, where you can't live a life of active virtue. And so you just can't be happy. So that kind of luck is luck that can influence whether or not you become virtuous, whether or not you come to have the happy life. But here's what Aristotle also thinks. resultant luck is something the virtuous person is basically immune to, except in really extreme circumstances. So, constitutive luck and circumstantial luck, because it's luck in determining what kind of person you turn out to be and what kind of opportunities you have, that's something that can impact whether or not you ever become a good person. But resultant luck can't, or at least within normal situations, resultant luck can't take someone who is happy and make them unhappy. Because, well, for one thing, he says a virtuous person is going to be more likely to deal with bad luck better, right? So let's say you're already living a life where you're a virtuous, happy person, and bad things start to happen to you. Right? You lose your job because the business you worked for went under because, I don't know, coronavirus or something like that. You suffer misfortunes in terms of like your country loses a war or something like that. Your favorite sports team goes under, I don't know, something like that. Yeah, the things you enjoy doing, you can't do anymore. What Aristotle thinks is, if you are a truly virtuous person, you are going to be better situated than anyone else to deal with this bad luck. And you're going to find a way to preserve a happy life regardless, except in really extreme circumstances. And he brings up the case of Priam, King Priam or Priam of Troy. If you're not familiar with the Trojan War, King Priam of Troy was a happy and just man who was ruling over the city of Troy. One of his children, who he had attempted to get rid of earlier in life anyway because he knew he was a problem, named Paris, kidnapped the queen of Sparta, causing all the Greek cities and kingdoms to declare war on Troy, which ended with Priam's city in flames, his older son, the dutiful, accomplished son, Hector, dead, his grandchild by Hector dead. He died, his city was destroyed, everything he had spent his whole life working for was destroyed. In that case, Aristotle's like, well, okay, if it goes that far, right, then yeah. But in the normal range of resultant luck, Aristotle thinks once you have virtue, once you have started living a life of active virtue, that can't really be taken away from you by luck. The context in which he discusses this is the context of the question of whether or not we can declare someone happy while they're still alive, or do we have to wait for their whole life to have already occurred before we decide whether or not they lived a happy, good life. And Aristotle is going to say, basically, with the exception of weird cases like King Priam of Troy, extreme cases like that, yeah, we can decide while someone's still alive that they're happy and that they have the good life. Because once you have it, and whether or not you have it is impacted by constitutive luck and circumstantial luck, but once you have it, if your constitutive luck and circumstantial luck were either good or not so bad that it prevented you from becoming a virtuous, happy person in the first place, once you have virtue, once you have happiness, it's very, very difficult to lose it. That's one of its attractions, Aristotle thinks, is that it does render you more immune to luck than other people. Go back to the point I made a little earlier, or the point of Aristotle's that I described a little earlier, that basically any life, or at least a wide range of lives, are lives in which you could experience pleasure. But some kinds of pleasure are extremely sensitive to resultant luck. If you only take pleasure in things that require money to do, right? If you only take pleasure in like going to amusement parks or going to the club or buying expensive stuff, your happiness, or at least your pleasure, is almost entirely dependent on luck. Because if like there's a stock market crash, like it's happening right now, then you're screwed, right? The life that gives you joy will maybe no longer be possible for you. But if you're a virtuous person, you can take these kinds of bad events, these unlucky events, more or less in stride. Right? And that's one of the reasons why the life of reason, the life of virtue, is going to be a better life, even from the perspective of pleasure, than most other lives. because you'll learn to love the things that your character inclines you to do. If you're a virtuous person, you'll learn to love to do virtuous things. And Aristotle thinks this life is as immune from luck as possible. But no life is immune from the constitutive or circumstantial kind of luck. Aristotle also briefly discusses the puzzling question about whether or not it's possible for a person's happiness or the goodness of their life to be lost after they die. And you might think, well, no, obviously you're dead. What can happen to you after you're dead? Well, if you're only thinking about pleasure, nothing, right? This goes back to Plato's argument in the Apology. Either after death there's nothing, or there's the afterlife, where you can expect a good reward if you've been a good person. So if you have lived a virtuous life your whole life, then you seem like you'll be in the situation Socrates was in, where like, I got no worries. Right? But Aristotle doesn't think the good life is about how you feel. It's not about pleasure. He thinks you'll have pleasure if you're living a good life, but that's not what makes it a good life. What makes it a good life is certain kinds of activities, or to put it another way, certain kinds of projects. Right? You live an active life when there's all sorts of things you're trying to do. So for example, one thing that most people end up trying to do is to have a family, right? And to raise your children well. Not everybody, but lots of people. Plato didn't apparently have any children, so Aristotle would have known that. Not everybody does this, but his example of how it seems like the quality of your life can change after you die is in what happens to your children after you die. Right? Suppose that you raise your children and you try to set them up as well as you can for them to have the kind of lives that they find fulfilling and good. And then sometime after you die, bad luck wipes out all that work, right? You saved for them to go to college, and you saved for them to have money to get themselves set up well after they were done with college, ready to go out in the world. And let's say you die before any of that happens, and then before they can go to college, before they can get themselves started in life, buy a house, make investments, whatever, a stock market crash happens and wipes out everything. Well, if that was one of your important projects in life, which was preparing your children to have a good life when they became adults, Aristotle seems to think, it's hard to see how that couldn't, like bad things happening to your children after you die, it's hard to see how that couldn't impact how well that project went. And if that project turned out to be a failure, if all the sacrifices you made to set your children up later in life turned out to be in vain, then it's hard to see how that wouldn't impact your life. But he says, again, in the normal course of things, the kinds of impacts that posthumous harms can have on you are going to be small if you're already a good and happy person. If you're already a good and happy person, how good or how happy your life turned out to be will depend a little bit on what happens after you die, but not for the most part. So Aristotle wants to say that there are some ways in which luck can impact happiness. Very, very, very extreme resultant luck can do it, and he thinks constitutive and circumstantial luck, although again he doesn't use these terms, but these are the things he's talking about. They can have a big impact about whether you ever become happy or virtuous in the first place. But once you become virtuous or happy, the fact that only extreme resultant luck, bad resultant luck, could take that from you is actually one of the good things about a virtuous life. It's one of the things that makes it the best kind of life. And here we've come to the end of book 1. From here on out, we'll be dealing with book